Hi there, so this is Sarah, and today I'm gonna go through the recording I made of making a nice glowy looking forest scene, and it does take me quite a while to actually make these paintings, so I'm probably going to break this up into two videos, like a part one and part two, just because I don't think anyone wants to sit through 3 hours of this. But anyway, so we'll get started with materials first. So for this video, I'll be using Arches hot press. It's about 12 by 16 inches, and I know some people like to use just one or two brushes for their paintings. I really like brushes. I like to have a variety, so I usually use between 5 and maybe 7 brushes because I really enjoy the different types of brushes and the different effects they can create depending on what you're using. So I'll be using a large oval mop, a decent sized round, I have a small squirrel quill, I have a few natural hair rounds or filberts I'll be using, and then a small rigger. And I may also, as the painting goes on, introduce a few other different types of brushes. We'll see. I can't quite remember right now off the top of my head. Definitely have clean water, prerequisites. I'm going to have a large palette that I will be pulling paints from to use on a smaller palette, just because there's some mucky stuff on the big palette that I don't really want to get introduced into the painting. Let's see, is there anything else? I don't think so. So I will probably speed up different parts of the video just to kind of shorten the overall time, and we'll be pausing, not necessarily pausing, but I will be not necessarily talking throughout the entire thing, and we'll mostly just kind of pop in to maybe discuss why I'm doing something, or if I hit a really critical point, to discuss what that critical point is. And hopefully this will be an informative and useful tutorial. I apologize for the lighting. It's been really quite gloomy here the past week or so, and my studio isn't in the way of much natural light, so I have to use an overhead light, and it does throw things off a little bit, so I apologize for that. We're going to be moving soon, hopefully, so with any luck we'll have better natural lighting, and you may end up hearing my delightful parrot shriek a little bit every now and again. She gets very excited when I record or when I talk, so I will try to edit out those noises if possible, but there might be a little squeak or whistle here and there. So anyways, we'll get started. On secondary bases, it's really just going to kind of muck things up a bit. Granted, it can definitely result in some very interesting and maybe pleasantly unexpected effects in your painting, but if you have a definitive goal that you're going for, you're best off just taking the extra few minutes and letting it dry fully. Now at this stage, you will also be figuring out what light you want to preserve. So for me, that was the light coming in from the right hand side of the painting in a kind of like a downward angle. So I'm making sure not to pigment that because it's not going to be light if I actually paint over it. As some of you will definitely already know, watercolor is very unforgiving in terms of trying to go back to white. You can't really do it. Yes, you can make things lighter, but you will never retain white again if you put pigment over something. And it's a bit of a slow process at first, but it's definitely worth your while not to rush it, because this is something you should also just be enjoying at the same time. If you're trying to rush through a painting, then, well, to each their own, but for me, painting is something to do because you love it, not because you want to get it done. I should also note that at this point I'm not actually going for any definitive shapes, it's just more blocking in the specific colors that I want to build on top of. And at this point I will be actively trying to remove water spots, so areas where water is pooling, and to do so I'll remove the water from my brush and we'll put the brush into the water spots to eliminate that extra pooling, because water spots can lead to some really unsightly defects in the painting. And then also just going through and dropping in some pigment. And one of the things that people find annoying about the way I paint or function as a human is that I tend to work in a zigzag pattern, just subconsciously moving, well, subconsciously noticing thing, which then directs my conscious movements to a specific area where apparently my brain seems to think I need to affix or attend. So you may see me starting up on top somewhere of the painting and then moving down to the bottom and then over to the side or things like that. And it can be frustrating. I don't do it to annoy people. It's just simply how I function. One of the very nice aspects of hot press paper is that it's very easy to remove pigment. Of course, you won't get back to the white of the paper, but you can create some neat effects with this capacity of the hot press paper, and that's how I make my light rays coming through trees. So while your pigment on the paper is still wet, it has to be wet for this, you can dry out your paintbrush to about 75% dampness, and you could tell that by lightly touching your paintbrush to your hand or your palm, the back of your hand, whatever you choose, and making sure that there is no water left on your hand. If it's too dry, it's just going to smear the paint around, so make sure when you test, there's no water left on your hand when you touch the brush to your hand, but then also with your fingertips, feel the tip of the brush, and if the brush bristles feel dry to you, they need to be a little bit wetter. But if they're still kind of damp, but they're not leaving water on the back of your hand, then it's at the appropriate dampness to do this technique. So what you do is, in the area that you want to create a light beam coming through, you very firmly and quickly drag the brush, and you're kind of pushing down on it, on the paper anyways, drag it in the direction that you want the light beam to be going, as you can see me doing in this painting. And it's a great technique to create those light rays. The only downside is, and this is personally an issue that I have anyways, is that sometimes my light rays get a little wobbly, which of course we know light beams don't actually look wobbly. So one of the things that helps me to correct those is to then do the exact same technique but in the opposite direction. For whatever reason, I can make straighter lines if I go instead of from right to left, from left to right. So I'll just make my initial light beam going from left to right, and then I'll make right to left for the initial and then the opposite direction. So at this point, the background layers have dried, so I can start adding on my secondary layers, and I'm going to employ a wet onto wet technique for this part to keep the kind of flowy aspect going. And at this part, I'm making another tree to kind of frame where that light is coming through. And as you can see, I'm dropping in some nice deep scarlet red to create my second little tree. So now at this point I'm going through and I'm working on top of my first base layer. So I will have, I shouldn't call them base layers, as base kind of implies the very bottommost layer, but I do have layers that I continually work on top of. I know a lot of painters have this wonderful capacity to just wet things up, throw pigment on the paper, and then pretty much call it good. And I wish I could operate that way, but that's just not how I work. So I'm going to continue to add layers and change things and fiddle here and there, which you're not necessarily supposed to do in watercolor, but I have fun with it, so I'm going to keep doing it. But anyway, so as I'm adding these layers, especially to the background in the kind of upper left-hand area of the painting, I'm going for a nice dark background foresty area that will better add contrast to where the light is coming through, since I want that to be my focal point of the painting. So I'm going to be adding a lot of Prussian blues and greens, and we'll probably, if I remember correctly, be adding a decent amount of deep scarlet to kind of make things a little more interesting. I like to add all three colors that I'm using in the painting in all aspects of the painting, so I continue to have that continuity. So one of the things you'll see me doing, and this is a preferred technique of mine, I really enjoy doing it, is I will put down pigment somewhere in a dry area of the painting, and then I will wet out my brush, get it nice and clean, and introduce water to the area adjacent to the pigment, and I will let the pigment flow into the water so it creates a really nice flowy look. And I may only wet part of the initial pigment areas, only part of it flows through, so part of it will have a hard edge and then part of it will have a nice flowy edge. It's one of the things I really like to do for tree leaves or bushes, of that nature, so you can kind of have a nice hazy look, and then you can also have some concrete defined edges too. So now I think at this point I'm on the fourth or fifth what I would consider layer, and at this point I'm starting to add in some of the finer details in the areas I want to bring closer to the viewer, and then also going to be adding more pigments to the area behind. So like where I want my kind of vague tree shapes to be, I'm going to be making darker and adding some more oranges and greens, and then we'll be layering over those eventually with a deeper layer of the Prussian blue and scarlet red combo to kind of push those back further. But we'll get there eventually. Not there yet. So now we're going to be adding some of the really high contrast pigments to make certain parts of the painting pop out, like in the two trees that are on the right hand side and in the foreground, because I want this to kind of look like a light beam coming down a trail and dark woods on either side of it, kind of like a, what you call uplifting or whatnot. But anyways, that's the image I have in my head that I want to achieve. So one of the things about light coming through is that you're also going to have shadows, and I'm very aware that I don't always do this most appropriately. Sometimes I'll have multiple light sources coming through, but if I think it looks good, I'm going to keep it. If I don't think it looks good, I'm going to get rid of it. But anyways, so for this painting, since we have the light beam coming through between those trees, we're also going to have some shadows here and there, and I might not get them all right, but I think they look okay, so I'm going to keep them. So I added some horizontal lines across what I would consider at this point to have been trail, but I realized at this point that I also kind of like the idea of it maybe almost looking like a little bit of a river, or like there were steps there or something to that extent. So, and it also will kind of bridge the divide between the lower right hand side of the painting where I have those dark blue and green pigments, and the kind of like the upper left hand side of the pigments, so where the white of the paper had been previously dividing those sections, now they're bridged in a way.